this message is part of the series entitled The Promise of His Coming. Tonight we're going to be looking at wars, we're going to be looking at earthquakes, and we're going to be looking at diseases and pestilences as we begin to see things ramp up exactly as the Bible said they would right before Jesus Christ returns for his church and then returns to set up his kingdom here on the earth. So we're going to start in Luke 21. We're just going to read verses 5 through 11. Luke 21, verse 5. And while some were talking about the temple, that it was adorned with beautiful stones and votive gifts, he said, this is Jesus speaking, "As for these things which you are looking at, the days will come in which there will not be left one stone upon another, which will not be torn down." And they questioned him, saying, "Teacher, when therefore will these things be? And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place?" And he said, "See to it that you not be misled. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and the time is at hand. Do not go after them. And when you hear of wars and disturbances, do not be afraid or terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end does not follow immediately." Verse 10, then he continued by saying to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be great earthquakes, and in various places plagues and famines, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven." Let's have a word of prayer. Father, thank you for this time. Thank you for everyone who's here tonight. We just pray, Father God, that you would bless your word, and Lord, that you might prepare our hearts to live for you. In Jesus' name, amen. In Ezekiel chapter 3, God gave Ezekiel a scroll as he was prophesying judgment against his people. And Ezekiel said that the scroll was like honey in his mouth, sweet to the taste. John, the beloved disciple who wrote the book of Revelation after God gave him this vision and this prophecy for the future, or prophecy of the future, John says something similar with the prophecies of the judgments that are to come in the book of Revelation. In Ezekiel, it was the judgments that were coming upon the house of Israel for their sin and rebellion against God, which God did indeed judge Israel and brought everything against them that he said he was going to. In Revelation chapter 10, verse 9, John says, "I went to the angel, telling him to give me the little book," or the little scroll, "and he said to me, 'Take it and eat it, and it will make your stomach bitter, but in your mouth it will be as sweet as honey.' And I took the little book," or the little scroll, "out of the angel's hand, and I ate it, and it was in my mouth sweet as honey, and when I had eaten it, my stomach was made bitter. And they said to me, 'You must prophesy again concerning many peoples and nations and tongues and kings.'" When we study prophecy, especially the prophecies of the book of Revelation, the prophecies of the last days of the end times, it's going to get worse, far worse for humanity and for everyone who's alive on planet Earth during the tribulation period. And as we study these things, it's almost like these teachings, the book of Revelation, these prophecies, they're exciting. There's almost a sweetness to them in our mouth. It's like it kind of tastes sweet to see that God is going to finally judge sin. He's going to finally obliterate his enemies. He's going to finally set things right. He's going to finally judge the devil and all of those who rejected Christ. That's sweet to us as Christians. We're looking forward to that day when God's kingdom comes and when his will is done on earth as it is in heaven. But we also must remember that there are a lot of people who are going to suffer and die during this time. Probably some of your loved ones and my loved ones are going to suffer and die during this time if they're not saved, if they're not raptured, if they're not part of Christ's church who's taken out of the way before the judgment comes. And that should make you sick to your stomach. It should make you sick to think about as you study these things. It's kind of sweet to think about the judgment of God. Get them, God. Bring the judgment down. They deserve it, right? It's kind of sweet to us for God to judge sin. But if you've ever seen what war looks like, they say war is hell for a good reason, because it's terrible. It's beyond words how terrible war is. If you've seen pestilences and plagues, if you've ever experienced a disastrous earthquake or a hurricane or the results of a tornado or a tsunami, these sorts of things that happen are just devastating, and the destruction sometimes is total, and many people are going to suffer. Billions of people are going to die at this time. Easily 1/2 to 3/4 of the world's population will be dead by the end of the tribulation period, according to the Bible. And so we ought not to be too excited about this, guys. We ought not to be, too anticipatory, looking forward to this time that we get swept away to heaven. Yes, that's wonderful for us, but God loves everybody. That's why he's showing patience to mankind. That's why he hasn't judged man yet in this way, because God is so long-suffering. He doesn't want to bring his wrath and his judgment. He's giving people time to repent. He's giving them space to repent so that they can be saved, so that he could deliver them from the judgment which is to come. And so keep that in mind as we study prophecy. All of these things were predicted thousands of years ago, and they are happening like clockwork. It's like reading tomorrow's newspapers today. We know what's already happening. We know what's going to happen. God has told us. And then we begin to see it all being fulfilled all around us. And yet it is a terrifying thing. It's a terrible thing to imagine what's going to be taking place during this time. If you think of the Holocaust, if you think of Hitler's regime and what he did to the Jews, that is a small shadow or type of who the Antichrist is going to be. Hitler was a monster. The Antichrist is going to be much worse than Hitler was, actually. And he's going to kill more people than Hitler ever could have imagined killing, including trying to exterminate and eliminate the Jews, just like Hitler tried to eliminate and exterminate the Jews. So back in Luke 21, we see that Jesus is trying to prepare us and his disciples. We're his disciples now. He was talking to his disciples then about what is coming, about what's going to happen. He tells them that the temple's going to be destroyed, and not one stone will be left upon another. That happened in 70 AD. That was done. That was finished, exactly as Jesus said it would be done. But then they asked him in verse 7 about the end of times, the last days, his coming kingdom. And so we have about a 2,000-year gap there in the prophecy between what would take place in 70 AD and what's going to take place still yet in the future with these other signs that are coming. But the bottom line is, if Jesus says it, it's going to happen. Jesus is God, and God cannot lie. And so all of these things will happen. Whether it happens in our lifetime or not, nobody knows. No one knows the day or the hour. But everything is going to happen exactly as Jesus declares that it will. So they asked him in verse 7, "Teacher, when therefore will these things take place? And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place?" So now they're talking about the future. They're wondering about him coming to set up his kingdom. We know that from Matthew chapter 24, a similar story that's recorded for us of Jesus teaching his disciples on the Mount of Olives. The teaching is called the Olivet Discourse. Jesus said to them, verse 8, Luke 21, "See to it that you not be misled. For many will come in my name, saying, I am he." In other words, there's going to be many people coming saying they are Jesus, they are the Christ. "And the time is at hand." He says, "Do not go after them." And we have seen this happen across the world where you have had false Christs, you had people calling themselves Jesus, you've had cult leaders like Jim Jones up in San Francisco, David Koresh out in Waco, Texas, just to name a couple. You have the Indian gurus, the Hindu and Buddhist gurus who claim to be Christ. They claim to be the consciousness of Christ or possessed by the Spirit of Christ. And they claim to be Christ. Some of them do miracles right before people's eyes. Obviously, it's not Jesus. It's another spirit. It's another power that they have opened up to. And this is a sign that we are living in the last days. You have false Christs within the cults that invent a different Jesus. They invent a different gospel. They have a different spirit. It's not the Holy Spirit. They have a different Bible, a different holy text. And yet they claim to be Christians. They claim that what they're teaching is Christianity. And many of them, the leaders, even claim to be Jesus. And so we have studied some of this earlier in our teaching through 1st and 2nd Peter. If you go back a few months on our podcast or go back to our YouTube channel, back probably 6 months ago, I would say around the October-November timeframe, we were looking at false prophets, false teachers, and heretical doctrines in the last days. And it's rampant. It is rampant. But we've already spent some time on that. And that is happening and getting worse with the internet and with the dissemination of wrong and false information throughout the world. But Jesus says, do not go after them. Verse 9, and when you hear of wars and disturbances or rumors of wars, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end does not follow immediately. Then he continued by saying to them, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And so the first thing that Jesus is telling them here in the Olivet Discourse that we're going to look at this evening is the idea of war. Now remember, when Jesus is teaching these prophecies, he has already told us in Matthew chapter 24, verse 8, that these signs that are going to take place, these events that are going to take place will be like what? The birth pangs of a woman. We've mentioned that over and over again. What are the birth pangs of a woman like? Any woman who's ever had a child could tell you the labor pains increase in frequency and they increase in intensity until the baby comes. And so people will say, and critics will say, well, there's always been earthquakes. There's always been wars. There's always been pestilence. There's always been cults. There's always been false religious teachers. You know, all of these things have always taken place. There's always been hurricanes. There's always been tornadoes and tsunamis and so forth, diseases and pestilence. And indeed, there always has. Ever since the very beginning in the Garden of Eden, when man sinned and rebelled against God, the wages of sin is death. And we have experienced all of these things from the very beginning of the rebellion of our first parents, Adam and Eve, in the Garden of Eden. However, Jesus specifies that when his coming is near, that these signs and events will increase in frequency and intensity. They're going to be happening more often, and they're going to be more intensely happening when they do happen. And so keep that in mind as we study this, that everything we're looking at has always happened in the world. There's always been these events and these signs that have happened. But as we get closer and closer to the actual return of Jesus Christ, they're going to be coming with more rapidity, more frequency, and more severity, more intensity, which is, I believe, what we are seeing happen today. Jesus said that there will be nation that will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. Some Bible translators say that Jesus is actually talking here about world war, that in the context it's everybody kind of fighting against each other. Nations would be sovereign countries with kings and kingdoms and rulers and boundaries and so forth, one nation attacking another. Kingdom against kingdom would actually be the tribes, the tribal groups with different dialects, maybe different traditions, maybe living in different parts of the same country fighting against each other. So basically, you have sovereign nations fighting against sovereign nations, and then you have individual tribal groups or religious groups fighting against themselves. And so it is a very actually apropos description of world war. And so Jesus says, look for this. This is going to be a sign that you're living in the last days. There's going to be war, and it's going to be prevalent, and it's going to be devastating to the people on the earth. Now, war has been occurring ever since the very first children born to the very first parents, Adam and Eve. Cain murdered his brother Abel. And so fratricide was how it all started. And God told them, the day that you eat from this, you will surely die, and death will come as a result of your disobedience. And it wasn't Adam and Eve's death initially. It was the death of their own son at the hand of their other son. And unimaginable to think about your own son killing his brother, and you can't stop it. You don't do anything about it. And you have to suffer through the loss, because really, Adam and Eve lost both sons when Cain murdered Abel. Far greater pain and penalty for them than if they had just died immediately when they disobeyed God. But that was really the first example of war that took place, and we've had war, guys, ever since on planet Earth. Historians tell us that there's never been a time that actually there has never been a day on planet Earth where there hasn't been war taking place somewhere on the planet. All the way back in history, as far as the records go, there's always been war. And sometimes it's war on the other side of the world. It's not war here. Sometimes it's war on another continent. Sometimes people have war perpetually, indefinitely. It seems like they're always fighting. Look at the countries in the Middle East. If they're not fighting the countries outside the Middle East, they're killing each other. Tribal warfare between the different Arab groups and the different peoples with interest in oil over there and so forth. The Sunnis and the Shiites killing each other, who are all Muslims, but they don't believe the same way. You have the Christians through the Crusades, killing each other and killing the Jews, and the Muslims killing the Christians from Europe. And there's just always been this. There's always been war. But Jesus says it's going to be a sign that wars are going to increase in frequency and intensity like the birth pangs of a woman before Jesus Christ returns. As I mentioned on Sunday, that there have been more people killed in wars in just the 20th century alone, the last century, from 1900 to the year 2000. In the 20th century alone, there have been more people killed by wars than all of human history. If you total up all the casualties and deaths of all the wars that are recorded for us in the historical account, and you add up all of those deaths from war up until the time of the 20th century, there were more people killed by war in the 20th century than in all the previous centuries and millennia before, combined. And so if that's not an indicator to us that wars are increasing in frequency and intensity, relatively recently for us, then we are just naive, and really we are blind to what's right in front of us. I looked up the statistics. In World War I, at least 37 million people were killed in World War I. At least 37 million people. There were probably more than that, but that's the number that they have been able to count for World War I. Of course, World War I was so terrible with the chlorine gas attacks and the trench warfare and the diseases in the trenches through lack of sanitation and so forth, where these men were just there for months and sometimes years, dug into trenches, and then they were using chemical weapons on each other for really the first time in history. Chemical weapons were being used in war, and it was terrible. And all of the people said who lived through World War I, we will never have another war like that again. It was too awful. And nobody would want to suffer like that again. And certainly the European countries, where all of it took place in their backyard, they said Europe will never, ever have another world war. That was what all the politicians said, all the leaders said after 1918 when World War I ended. Well, then you have Hitler and you have Stalin and you have World War II. And World War II far exceeded World War I when it came to casualties and deaths and devastation and destruction and the power of weapons being used against each other. There were between at least, again, these are conservative numbers, between 70 to 85 million people killed in World War II, which really only lasted about 4 years. 1940 to 1945, maybe 5 years. We were only in the war for about 4 years, from 41 to 45. And so you have at least double the casualties from just 25 years earlier. So when people thought, oh, we've had our fill of war, nobody's ever going to want to go to war again, then you have a war that's 2 or 3 times more destructive than the war that took place in the early part of the 20th century. As a matter of fact, World War II was so catastrophic, they say that at least 3% of the population of the world was killed in World War II. So you take the population of the world, when World War II started, 3% of that population was killed. That's a big number. I think they say it was about 2.3 billion people on the planet during World War II, and upwards of 85 million people killed conservatively, 3% of the world's population. Of course, our country's been in wars after that, the Vietnam War, the first Gulf War, the second Gulf War, the war in Afghanistan. We're still at war with Afghanistan. That war's never really ended. And that's just America. I mean, there's lots of wars going on and rumors of wars all over the world today. Today, we have more power when it comes to our weapons, more powerful weapons, and more accurate and destructive delivery systems of delivering those weapons to our enemies and our enemies to us than any other time in human history. As a matter of fact, we don't even know the technology that our government has, or really, for that matter, what our enemies, the technology that our enemies have, because it's all secret stuff. They don't publicize it. But just from what is public information, we could wipe out humankind at least 1,000 times over just with the nuclear arsenal that we possess and that Russia possesses. If we unleashed all of our nuclear weapons that are publicly known about, and Russia released all of their nuclear weapons, which everybody publicly knows about, not the stuff that we don't know about, we could wipe out planet Earth 1,000 times over. And so certainly we have the potential to obliterate humankind on planet Earth without any help from the devil or without God pouring out his wrath upon us, just because of the technology and the development of weapon systems that we possess today. Right now we have a situation over in Iran. We've been looking at that in prior studies. There is a future war that is predicted that hasn't happened in Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39, the war of Gog and Magog, Iran and Russia attacking Israel. And this has not yet happened. It's going to happen. But we see that the stage is set for that war to take place. If you take China, who, by the way, China's military is not equivalent to America's military, but it is their goal to catch up with us by, I think, 2025, maybe 2030. They are the leaders of AI technology. And they are implementing AI technology all throughout their country and all throughout their system, their military systems. And so, China by itself probably could not take, let's say, America on in a head-to-head, toe-to-toe war. But China wouldn't be alone if they went to war with us. They would have Russia right at their side. And if you add Russia's ability and their weapon systems and their armies and navies and nuclear arsenal and so forth, if you took China and Russia you would then have an equivalent to the American military. As a matter of fact, it would be almost impossible for us to fight against Russia and China at the same time because we'd be spread too thin. And of course, we are the most powerful military on the planet. Our country dwarfs any other nation or groups of nations, really, when it comes to our military ability and our technology and our weapons and so forth. But you have Iran, you have China, you have North Korea, and you have Russia. And these guys would all gladly ally themselves together against America if it ever came down to it. That's not a big secret. And so we see that, we may have peace and security here in America today. We may not be fighting against an enemy on our own soil, but believe me, the war is coming. Whether we're going to be here to see a war or not, I don't know. But war is coming to everyone on the earth in the last days. And there could be a situation that happens that would drag us into a war or drag these other nations into a war against us just by accident or by happenstance or circumstance of events that no one can control. The Iranians are over there meddling in the Persian Gulf. Many of you probably saw the news today. You don't have to spend a lot of time researching the news to see that all of this stuff is happening all the time in the news now. It's not like you have to go looking hard to find stories about these wars that are taking place or that they are potentially going to be happening. Iran is not taking responsibility, but our country is saying that Iran is responsible for attacks in the Persian Gulf this morning or yesterday, where in the Strait of Hormuz, the U.S. is blaming Iran for attacks on 2 tankers in the Gulf of Oman on Thursday. So that was this morning. It happened today over in the Persian Gulf. Pompeo says that Iran is responsible for the tanker attacks. Of course, Iran is denying responsibility, as they always do, but Iran works through proxy military organizations like Hezbollah, like the Houthi rebels in Yemen. They finance them, they fund them, they are the ones who are driving them and supplying them to do these attacks. But it says oil prices from the Wall Street Journal from today. Oil prices rose sharply amid fears of disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz, through which over a third of the world's seaborne crude oil is shipped. The U.S. blamed Iran for attacks on 2 tankers in the Gulf of Oman on Thursday, saying the assaults were the latest in a series of hostile actions meant to disrupt the flow of oil. Quote, taken as a whole, these unprovoked attacks present a clear threat to international peace and security, a blatant assault on the freedom of navigation, and an unacceptable campaign of escalating tension by Iran, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said, vowing the U.S. would defend itself and its partners. The flare-up is the latest since President Trump's decision last year to pull out of a 2015 international deal to cap Iran's nuclear program. 4 tankers were attacked last month in the Gulf of Oman, an incident the U.S. also blamed on Iran. Mike Pompeo presented no evidence to support his claim about Iran's involvement. Iran has denied responsibility for any of the attacks, including Thursday's, and suggested hostile actions might be the work of actors seeking to draw the region into chaos. And so this just happened today. We have the players of the Ezekiel 38 and 39 war right there in the Middle East. We have Iran, ancient Persia, who is flexing their muscles, and basically they're upset because they're not allowed to sell their oil, and that's all they really have to sell is oil over in Iran. And we have put sanctions on them, and we're not allowing them to sell their oil, and so they're very upset. Their economy is collapsing, their currency is falling apart because they can't get their oil sold on the open market. And so now they are beginning to attack other oil tankers in the Persian Gulf to try and disrupt the oil supply around the world. This could easily turn into a regional war. We're there now with our aircraft carriers, and we have troops over there. And we could easily get sucked into a war with Iran. If Iran went into a war with us, Russia would not be far behind on Iran's side, and I don't think China would be far behind Russia. There's a lot of people in the world that hate the United States of America. All you have to do is travel overseas to find that out. People love you as an American. They love your tourist dollars. When you're in other countries, they love you as an American, but they hate America. They really do hate America. There's a lot of people in the world that would like to see America dethroned as the world's leader and derailed as the leading military and economic powerhouse on the planet. And so these things are happening. They're happening today. They're happening right before our eyes. Now, the Bible talks about a war called the Battle of Armageddon. Many of you have heard that. It has become a very well-known future war that even non-Christians and secular people have heard of, the last days battle of Armageddon. Where do we learn about the Battle of Armageddon, this war, this great war that is to come at the very end of this age? Well, the book of Revelation speaks about it. In Revelation chapter 9, we are told that there will be an army from the east of 200 million people, or 200 million men. Revelation 9 verse 14 says this: one saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. And the four angels who had been prepared for the hour and the day and the month and the year were released, so that they might kill a third of mankind. So 1/3 of mankind is going to be wiped out just from these four angels. Today that would be approximately, if 1/3 of mankind was killed today, it would be over 2 billion people. The population of the earth is pushing 8 billion. So you're talking over 2, maybe 2.5 billion people killed just from these four angels at that time. It says in verse 16, and the number of the armies of the horsemen was 200 million. And I heard the number of them. When this was written, there was no nation on earth that even had 200 million people alive in their nation. The population of the earth was likely not even 200 million when this was written. On the whole planet, if you took everybody and added them up, you couldn't get together 200 million people. But God gave us this number. He predicted that there would be this army of horsemen that would come, as we're going to see from the east when the river Euphrates is dried up, as part of the Battle of Armageddon. And today we have, with almost 8 billion people on planet Earth, we could easily see an army of 200 million coming from the east. China and India together could easily field a 200 million man army without any problems at all. As a matter of fact, in China, not only are they a military nation, a communist dictatorship, quasi-capitalistic country when it comes to economics, but the Communist Party owns that nation. They own the economy over there, and they have boasted that they could field an army of 200 million men easily because of their one-child policy that for decades after Mao was in power, he didn't want the people of China to overpopulate too much to where they wouldn't be able to feed themselves and defend themselves and so forth. So the communist regime implemented a one-child policy. And because of the Asian culture over there, women do not have the same rights as men. Women are not valued in that society as much as men are in the Asian culture still to this day. Most of the people who found out they were having a girl, if they're only allowed one baby, they aborted the girls. Some of them even just gave the girls to adoption, Christian adoption agencies. Some of them just left them in the dumpsters or set them outside to die because they couldn't keep more than one child. It was against the law for decades. So what you end up with is this population of men, only men, very few women in China. And it's a problem now. Now they want the Chinese to have as many babies as they can, to kind of make up for the shortfall because their whole economy is going to collapse on itself. If you have basically your population reduced by 50%, two parents only producing one child, you need at least 2.1 children per couple to stay afloat as a nation. And they have been basically at half of that for decades. They now want to make up the difference. And so now they're encouraging the couples to have many, many babies. But you still have this population of young men and population of men in their teens and 20s and 30s, and they outnumber the women dramatically. And so you see that this prophecy could easily, we don't know that they're going to come from China, but we know that they're going to come from the east, and that's pretty much where China is from Israel, is from the east. And there's going to be a 200 million man army that is going to come into the valley of Megiddo for the battle of Armageddon. Revelation 14 also speaks about this war, this battle. Revelation 14, verse 14 says this, "And I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and sitting on the cloud was one like a son of man, having a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, 'Put in your sickle and reap, because the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe.' Verse 16, "And he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. And another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, and he also had a sharp sickle. And another angel, the one who has power over fire, came out from the altar. And he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, 'Put in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe.'" So God is now talking about judgment being like a harvest of grapes, where the grapes are like the people that are gathered together, put into the wine vat, and stomped on, and the wine or the grape juice that comes out everywhere. And that is speaking of the blood of man that is going to be spilled during this time. "Put in your sharp sickle, gather the cluster from the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe." Verse 19, "And the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the clusters from the vine of the earth and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood came out of the winepress up to the horses' bridles, for a distance of 200 miles. Now, if you turn to the next page, Revelation 16, or the next the chapter after Revelation 15, you see this. Verse 12 tells us, "The sixth angel," still talking about the battle of Armageddon, "the sixth angel poured out his bowl upon the great river, the river Euphrates, and its water was dried up, that the way might be prepared for the kings from the east." So we have the 200 million man army that's coming. We have the wine press that is trodden outside the city, blood up to the horses' bridles for a distance of 200 miles. And you have this prophecy that the Euphrates River is going to be dried up. Now, when this was written, they didn't have the technology or the ability or the possibility of drying up the Euphrates River or barricading or blocking or damming up the Euphrates River, but they do now. The Euphrates River now has a damming system that can be shut off with a push of a button or the throwing of a lever, and the Euphrates River can be stopped and it will be dried up. The possibility is there today. The Euphrates River runs right through modern-day Iraq, and they have the ability to shut it down and cut it off if they chose to. And so this is another prophecy written 2,000 years ago that really couldn't have happened, at least from what we could understand. How could the Euphrates River be dried up? It's one of the biggest rivers in the Middle East. Well, now man could even do it. Terrorists could do it theoretically by the push of a button because of the damming system that is in place there. So the Euphrates River is going to be dried up for the purpose of making way or preparing for the kings from the east to come into the valley of Megiddo for this war. Verse 13, "I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon and out of the mouth of the beast And out of the mouth of the false prophet 3 unclean spirits like frogs, for they are the spirits of demons, performing signs which go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them together for the war of the great day of God, the Almighty. Then in parentheses, Jesus says, behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and keeps his garments, lest he walk about naked and men see his shame. Parenthetical verse with parentheses on both sides. Jesus speaking, warning that when he comes, it's going to be like a thief, so we better be ready. Verse 16, they gathered them together to the place which in Hebrew is called Harmageddon or Armageddon. And so all 3 of these prophecies are talking about the same war. Revelation 9, 200 million men. Revelation 14, the wine press of the wrath of God, the wine being blood, the blood coming out up to the horses' bridles for 200 miles. And we know where this war is going to take place. It's going to take place in the valley of Megiddo, in the Jezreel Valley of Israel. I have been to the Jezreel Valley. I have stood up there and looked down with my own eyes. I've taken pictures of the Valley of Megiddo, and it is vast. It is 200 miles across from end to end and top to bottom. Beautiful, actually. It's one of the most prolific growing areas. It's like a garden paradise there where they grow a lot of fruits and vegetables and flowers in Jezreel, the Valley of Megiddo today. But it's going to be a bloodbath in this day. And the idea that you could have blood spilled, you have enough people slaughtered here in this battle that you could have blood up to the horses' bridles for 200 square miles. That's a lot of blood. 200 square miles. Now that doesn't mean a horse that's standing 7 feet tall. But if a horse is dead in late, like in World War I and World War II and all of the other wars where they used horses, and they still use horses in war in many parts of the world, a horse, his bridle would be maybe 4, 5, or 6 inches off the ground. So to have blood for 200 miles, 4 inches deep, that's a lot of blood. That's a lot of people, men, who are going to be killed in this battle. And so, again, things are going to happen with increasing frequency and intensity, up until this war, which is really the battle to end all battles. And Jesus comes back at the end of this battle, and he wipes out his enemies, and he sets up his kingdom in Jerusalem. Back in Luke chapter 21, the next thing Jesus speaks on, signs of the times, is earthquakes. He says in Luke 21:11, and there will be great earthquakes. So, when we know that earthquakes are going to be increasing in frequency and intensity as we get closer to the end, what would we expect to see on planet Earth? We would expect to see more earthquakes happening in more places and more devastating earthquakes happening on planet Earth. And that's exactly what we see happening if we study the history of earthquakes. As a matter of fact, you could do your own research. I have dug into these numbers before. I've presented these numbers before. But with the internet, you are all geniuses. All you have to do is Google this and go to the U.S. Geological Survey and look at their data for the killer quakes, what they call killer quakes. I think it's 6.4 on the Richter scale or above, maybe 6.5 on the Richter scale or above. And what you see is whenever a big earthquake happened in history, it was a big deal. Historians wrote about it. They recorded it. If you had a huge earthquake, they may not have known how big it was. They may not have known this is a 6 or an 8 on the Richter scale, but they could say 1 million people were killed in this earthquake in Afghanistan or in Iran or in China or something like that. And it became part of their historical records that we had this huge earthquake and everybody knows about it. And it is in the data that we still have today. However, when they started actually monitoring earthquakes and they started to keep track of earthquakes, you see this increase in frequency of earthquakes around the world, not just because we have more sensitive ways of measuring earthquakes. That's a given that we have more ways to measure earthquakes today than they did 100 years ago. But if you just look at the numbers of killer quakes and you look at a timeline, you see them increasing around the world in frequency and intensity. You have more killer quakes taking place every decade than you did the decade before, from the time that they began to register them, monitor them, and keep records of these earthquakes. As I mentioned, on Sunday, there was a 6.1 magnitude earthquake in Panama. Big earthquake, not too far south of us, on May 12th of 2019. Didn't do a whole lot of damage or devastation, so it's kind of dropped off the news. But it was a big earthquake. In Mexico in 2017, interesting, they said that there was a tectonic plate that was fractured that baffled geologists, because they thought that tectonic plates, when earthquakes occur, you have these continental plates, these tectonic plates that are rubbing up against each other. They either rub forwards or backwards, up or down. They slip under or over one another, and that's when you have earthquakes that take place. And the greater the fault, the greater the slip or the movement of those tectonic plates, the larger the shaking, the greater the earthquake. But they saw something they'd never seen before. They didn't even know it was possible. These scientists and geologists, they said that the tectonic plate itself was fractured. It was broken in this earthquake. And they just thought, wow, we didn't know that could happen. We didn't know that you could fracture a plate. We just thought the plates rubbed against each other and you caused earthquakes. So we are going to be seeing more and more earthquakes happening in more and more places as we get closer to the end. That's what we should expect to see. That is what we do see. You know, out of sight, out of mind, right? We haven't had a big earthquake in California. Shh, don't talk about it. You're going to jinx us and we're going to have an earthquake. That's what we think. How foolish is that, to think that, you know, we should be talking about earthquakes every day in California. We have what? The Garlock Fault that's right over here. Is that what it's called? The Garlock Fault? Am I right, Jeff? Garlock Fault. Okay. That's right in our backyard. Matter of fact, it goes right through Jeff's property. So either Jeff's going to be in the safest place when it happens, or he's going to be in the worst place, but he'll go to be with Jesus, and so we'll probably all join him if that fault slips. It's just right over here in these hills where the windmills are. We have the San Andreas fault line, just right down here south and a little bit east of us, running right through the Antelope Valley and up through from here up through Northern California and down to Southern California. They're discovering faults that they didn't even know existed underneath San Francisco, underneath Sacramento, underneath Berkeley, underneath Los Angeles. All over California, we have these faults that have not shifted, have not slid, have not caused an earthquake to occur for decades. Some of them for hundreds of years, centuries. And what that means is that pressure is building. And the more time you have between earthquakes, the bigger the earthquakes are going to be, because there's pressure that has to be released. It has to be relieved. And so I was at an event with the county down in Lancaster, where there was 500 of the who's who of all of the Antelope Valley, and people from Los Angeles and Kern County were there. Elected public officials were there, and the head of the Red Cross for Los Angeles was there, and he was speaking about the fact that the thing that keeps him up at night, he is the head of the Red Cross's organization, Disaster Preparedness and Relief for Los Angeles, and he said the thing that keeps him up at night is another earthquake like the Northridge quake, which happened in January of 1994. We are so overdue for these earthquakes, it's not even funny. And he says that we were more prepared before the Northridge earthquake happened in 94, which was a total disaster. I remember it. Many of you remember it if you lived in Southern California at the time. I was shaken out of my bed at 4:30 in the morning in Fullerton, and I was working in a skyrise that day in Irvine on the 45th floor of this financial building, and we were swaying up there for weeks. We were swaying. I felt like I was on a ship because of how high we were from the aftershocks. And he's saying that wasn't even a big quake. What was it, 6.4, 6.6? That's not even a big quake. A big quake is 7.5, 8.0, 7.9, 8.5. And the longer time goes that we don't have earthquakes, the bigger the earthquake is going to be when it does happen. So he says it keeps him up at night because we were far more prepared in Los Angeles before the Northridge quake happened. And that was a total disaster. They were completely unprepared actually when it happened, but they were more prepared for that than we are today for the same sort of an earthquake because it's out of sight, out of mind. And so this is something that we have to be aware of. We should be, thinking about it and so forth. Again, with earthquakes, there was a series of earthquakes that happened recently in Los Angeles. And this was in the LA Times last week, an article in the LA Times Online last week. This article says this: if you live in Fontana, you wouldn't be blamed if you felt a case of the jitters. A swarm of earthquakes has shown remarkable staying power in the area around the Southern California city. Caltech seismologist, and I won't pronounce his name, Eagle something, said the chance that the series of tremors will turn into a large and destructive quake isn't particularly high, but that doesn't mean residents shouldn't be on their toes. The likelihood of a larger seismic event, given how many quakes that have occurred over such an extended period, is higher than normal, the scientist said. Quote, he says people ought to be concerned, unquote. He says this is probably the most prolific swarm in that area of the Fontana seismic zone than we have seen in the past 3 decades. There have been more than 700 earthquakes recorded in the Fontana area since May 25th, ranging from magnitude 0.7 to magnitude 3.2, recorded last Wednesday at 5:20 p.m. According to the Caltech staff seismologist Jen Andrews, 3 of the quakes have been of magnitude 3 or greater. The swarm initially moved northward, but then something unusual began Friday when the swarm turned around and went back south, back toward the middle of the activity and the 60 freeway. This is somewhat of an unexpected evolution, this scientist Hodgson said. Furthermore, on analysis of the earthquakes, it shows that activity as of late Friday was fading pretty slowly, slower than would be expected for a typical sequence of aftershocks following a main shock, he said. Quote, that would suggest it's going to continue for, I don't know, at least several more weeks. He says we're watching what's happening and trying to track that activity. So it's one of these things that they're saying this is just not normal. We haven't seen this before. We haven't seen this before in decades. We haven't seen a swarm of earthquakes start in one place, go to Northern California, and then come back to Southern California. It's unusual to say the least. He says the timing of the earthquakes is worth noting. Shaking followed by a lull and then a spurt of new quakes. The earthquakes have been relatively shallow, beginning at just 1 to 2.5 miles under the surface. As a result, the shaking has been widely felt. Residents in the Fontana area said there is talk about how the industrial wastewater ponds were drained recently, right around the time the quakes began, and so forth. They're researching the reasons. But he says on September 26, 2016, a rapid succession of small earthquakes, 3 measuring above magnitude 4.0, began erupting under the Salton Sea close to the San Andreas Fault, continuing for more than 24 hours. The swarm increased the likelihood of a major quake in Southern California, at least temporarily. Experts said the chance of a 7.0 or greater earthquake on the mighty San Andreas Fault increased significantly when these swarms were taking place 3 years ago. The odds went from 1 in 6,000 in any given week to as much as 1 in 100 during that particular week. And so it's coming. The Bible tells us it's coming. The seismologists tell us it's coming. The geologists tell us it's coming. Common sense tells us it's coming. And yet we yawn and we just kind of, don't think about it. And we don't want people to talk about it because they may jinx us and an earthquake may happen. Instead of us saying, hey, let's get water. Let's make sure that our houses, our pictures are anchored well to the walls, and we don't have things that are going to fall over, and we have an evacuation plan in place and so forth. I was with the head of Kern County's fire department, who's in charge. He was the Kern County fire chief. We were in a meeting together, and I was talking to him about emergency preparedness, because September is always emergency preparedness month. So they talk about emergencies and so forth, and everybody being prepared. And I said, are we prepared in Kern County for a major natural disaster? He says, no, absolutely not, not even close. If we had a major natural disaster, it would be chaos right here in Kern County within 72 hours. And so, you know, we don't like to think about these things. We don't like to talk about these things. But the reality is that we live in a very active earthquake zone. We live around, the ring of fire, the edge of the ring of fire, and we are way, way, way overdue. The way I see it is God's just being very merciful with us, and he's showing us mercy, and he's showing us grace, and he's also showing us, how wicked these cities have become, and and if God lets them go on indefinitely in their wickedness, there will be no hope for man. And so sometimes he has to judge us in order to stop us from continuing to destroy ourselves and one another. Now, the Bible talks in great deal about great earthquakes that are going to happen in the last days. Again, increasing in frequency and increasing in intensity. We saw in our study through Ezekiel 38 and 39, there was a great earthquake that takes place, part of the way that God destroys Israel's enemies who were invading them during that time. But also, the book of Revelation speaks about these great earthquakes. In Revelation chapter 16 and verse 18, we read this. And there were flashes of lightning and sounds and peals of thunder, and there was a great earthquake such as there had not been since man came to be on the earth. So great an earthquake was it, and so mighty. And the great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And Babylon the great was remembered before God, to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. And every island fled away, and the mountains were not found. And huge hailstones, about 100 pounds each, came down from heaven upon men, and men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, because its plague was extremely severe. And so God is talking about an earthquake like no earthquake in history that's going to shake the whole world. It says that this earthquake that's coming is going to be such a great earthquake and so mighty that there has never been an earthquake like this since man has been on planet Earth. It is going to be worldwide. It's not going to be just a local quake. It's like all of these major faults, and even the ones that we don't know about, are all going to go off at the same time. It says that the cities of the nations fell. If you think about all of the big cities around the world just collapsing, just coming down in a heap, this is what's going to happen when this earthquake occurs. Verse 20 says, every island fled away and the mountains were not found. So the islands are just going to be, they're going to drop. They're going to just go underwater. And the mountains are going to collapse under these earthquakes. They're just going to collapse down to the earth. Major shaking is coming. And these are still future judgments. But until these events happen, they are going to continue to increase in frequency and intensity. One more earthquake that is mentioned is in Revelation chapter 6, verses 12 through 17. I'll read it to you. And I looked when he broke the 6th seal, and there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth made of hair, and the whole moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth as a fig casts its unripe figs when shaken by a great wind, and the sky was split apart like a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and every island were moved out of their places. So this is likely speaking of the same earthquake that we just read about in Revelation chapter 16, because it talks about every mountain and every island being moved out of their places. Same language that was used in Revelation 16. Verse 15 of Revelation 6 says, "And the kings of the earth and the great men and the commanders and the rich and the strong and every slave and free man hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and to the rocks, 'Fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand?'" And isn't it true that the powerful, the rulers, the wealthy, the great, the strong, that they're already building underground caverns, underground places to hide from nuclear war or from natural disasters that are coming, these deep underground military bases that the government will neither confirm nor deny that exist, where there are entire bases underground that nobody knows about underneath mountains and so forth. Some of them probably likely right here in this part of Kern County. And you have all of these individuals, carving out these places underground to hide. And that's exactly what God predicted would be the case in the last days. Interesting. All you have to do is turn on a TV show about these preppers and these people that are preparing for the end times, and they all have their little bug out caves and everywhere else where they're going to hide with their beans and their AK-47s and think that they're going to survive what's coming. Exactly what God predicted would be the case with man in the last days. Instead of repenting before God, instead of crying out for mercy to God, they go underground and think they're going to survive this. They're going to fight against Jesus, Jesus who's coming to judge them. And instead of humbling themselves and repenting, they blaspheme him, we read earlier, and shake their fist at God because of the severity of the plagues which God is allowing to come upon the earth. The third thing that Jesus speaks about is pestilence or plagues and famines. Back in Luke 21:11, he says there will be great earthquakes and in various places plagues or pestilence or diseases and famines. We have more cases of measles and mumps and rubella taking place in our country, which is the leading country in the world when it comes to health. We have more of those cases now than we've had for 50 or 75 years because of immigrants coming in from other countries across our borders who are not immunized because they don't have the ability to be immunized because they're coming from poorer places. And so they are coming in and bringing these diseases, many of them contractable diseases because they've never gotten shots like our kids get shots before they have to go to public school to immunize against these diseases. And then you have a whole movement of people that think vaccinations is a conspiracy to annihilate the human race. And so between people who are not vaccinating their children and the people who are coming in with these diseases who are unvaccinated, it's keeping these scientists up at night. They're worried that we are going to have outbreaks of these diseases like they did with the bubonic plague and wipe out millions and millions and millions of people within just a matter of months and years. And so we see diseases right before our eyes that are increasing in frequency and intensity. And of course, around the world, people are struggling and suffering through poverty, through unclean conditions, unsanitary living conditions, unsanitary drinking water, and so forth. And yet Jesus says that it's going to be worse, and it's going to get worse as we get closer and closer to the end. There is a public health crisis right now in the city of Los Angeles, and it's all over the news. You don't have to look far to see this. This is in the second largest city in our country. Our country is the top country in the world in every way to measure it. We're number one economically, we're number one in military, we're number one in development and technology and so forth. And yet, Los Angeles is becoming just a total wasteland when it comes to disease and trash. The Daily Mail says that basically they have an article with shocking pictures from Los Angeles. The Daily Mail is over in London, and they had this article with shocking pictures from Los Angeles to capture the problem that it faces with trash. They said here in this article, a decision to not cap property that homeless people can keep on Skid Row was announced last Wednesday, and it sparked fury among some who say that it will only perpetuate the public health crisis that it already exists there. And again, Los Angeles is the second biggest city behind New York City in our country. It says, images from the downtown area show trash piling up as workers struggle to keep the area sanitized. Rows and rows of tents lined the sidewalks of Skid Row in the sprawling 50-block area, home to around 4,200. On Thursday, it was revealed that a Los Angeles police detective has been diagnosed with typhoid fever. At least 5 other officers are also showing symptoms, and their division polices downtown Los Angeles. Dustin Dorello, a union spokesman, said, and the cops who patrol Skid Row walk through feces, urine, and trash. In an op-ed for the LA Times, reporter Stephen Lopez called it, quote, the collapse of a city that has lost control. And then it goes into the pictures that it shows, which I can't show you, but it says, these shocking pictures from downtown Los Angeles capture the growing problem it faces with trash and rodents in a desperate city also trying to contain a typhoid fever outbreak linked to worsening sanitary conditions. The city has now said it will dispose of sofas, refrigerators, and other large items, but City Councilman Joe Basquiano slammed the decision, saying the settlement will only perpetuate the public health crisis that already exists in Skid Row and will set a precedent for the rest of the city, and that will normalize encampments. Quote, the city is sending a clear signal that we are turning the sidewalks in Skid Row into free, unlimited public storage, doing a disservice to the residents of Los Angeles, especially to those living on the streets. Images from the downtown area show trash piling up as workers struggle to keep the area sanitized. They are pictured wearing face masks among the dirt and grime. Rows and rows of tents line the sidewalks of Skid Row. Some lay out passed on the street, seemingly from the effects of drugs, as others are pictured lugging their property around in the search of the next spot to set up. Another LA Times article talking about this from June 2nd. The headline is Rats at the Police Station, Filth on the LA Streets, Scenes from the Collapse of a City That's Lost Control. He says the good news is that 2 trash-strewn downtown LA streets I wrote about last week were cleaned up by city work crews and have been kept that way as of this writing. The bad news is that I didn't have to travel far to find more streets just as badly fouled by the filthy mounds of junk and stinking, rotting food. Then there was news that the LAPD station on Skid Row was cited by the state for a rodent infestation and other unsanitary conditions, and that one employee there was infected with a strain of bacteria that causes typhoid fever. He asks, what century is this? Is it the 21st century in the largest city of a state that ranks among the world's most robust economies? Or did someone turn back the calendar a few hundred years? We've got thousands of people huddled on the streets, many of them withering away with physical and mental disease. Sidewalks have disappeared, hidden by tents and the kinds of makeshift shanties you see in third world places. Typhoid and typhus are in the news, and an army of rodents is on the move. On Thursday, I saw a county health inspector on rat patrol between 7th and 8th Streets on Skid Row. He was carrying a clipboard and said he had found droppings and other evidence of rodents. And I asked where. He said everywhere. Well, it's nice to know somebody's doing something about it, but you don't need a clipboard. I've seen so many rats the last 2 weeks in downtown Los Angeles, I have to suspect they're plotting a takeover of City Hall, which vermin infiltrated last year. The city of Los Angeles has become a giant trash receptacle. It used to be that illegal dumpers were a little more discreet, tossing their refuse in fields and gullies and remote outposts. Now city streets are treated like dumpsters or even toilets. On Thursday, the 1600 block of Santee Street was cordoned off after someone dumped a fat load of poop in the street. I'm not sure when any of this became the norm, but it must have something to do with the knowledge that you can get away with it. Every time sanitation crews knock down one mess, another dump site springs up nearby. It goes on. They are concerned that bubonic plague is going to begin with the same thing that caused the Black Plague back in the 1500s, the 1400s in Europe, with the rats and the fleas on the rats biting people and infesting them with bubonic plague that killed millions and millions of people, tens of millions of people throughout Europe at that time. You see pictures from Northern California, the city of San Francisco, with drug addicts passed out on the sidewalks, people having to step over bodies to get onto the public transportation, the BART trains that they have to ride to get to work. They have to step over bodies and hypodermic needles from drug addicts to get on and off the trains in San Francisco. They actually have thousands, or maybe it's hundreds, I may be exaggerating, but they have hundreds of workers. All they do is clean up hypodermic needles and poop on the sidewalks of San Francisco today. That's their full-time job. And they still can't make a dent in what's happening there. And so, guys, the diseases are here. The diseases are coming. And you know, we don't need to fear. We don't need to, be scared. We just have to be aware. We have to be aware of this. This is happening literally just a couple hundred miles away from us, not even that, in Northern California and Southern California, in two of the biggest cities and most profitable and economically successful cities in the world, San Francisco and Los Angeles. I mentioned on Sunday that STDs are just rampant among the population. 1 in 4 Americans, the last study I read, 1 in 4 Americans between the age of 18 and I think it was 35 today in America has an STD. That's 25% of the population at least. That's just what they know of. With the dating apps, with the internet, with the lack of morality in our culture to where it's pretty much do whatever you want, whenever you want, with whomever you want. That's the mantra and the motto of this generation. People are having more illicit sex relationships outside of traditional covenant of marriage, monogamous relationship between one man and one woman. And so it's just adding fuel to the fire. You have STDs exploding in our culture today, and the media is not talking about it because Hollywood doesn't want to put a kibosh on the movies they're making, the television they're putting out there, which just basically tells people do whatever you want, whenever you want, with whomever you want. The problem is that even the doctors and the medical community are saying, we don't have drugs to treat these STDs. Penicillin doesn't work to treat gonorrhea anymore. Gonorrhea has evolved and adapted to the point where penicillin is ineffective against it. They don't have a way to treat it, to take care of it. They may be able to treat the symptoms of gonorrhea, chlamydia, and these other sexually transmitted diseases, but they cannot get rid of the disease itself. And even some of the drugs are ineffective of treating the symptoms. And so you have all of these things doing what? Converging at the same time. If I were to tell you, one of these issues and the other 15 of them weren't happening, you could say, well, that's just one thing, Pastor Mike. Let's not exaggerate that we're living in the last days. But when it's everything, one thing after another, after another, after another, everything the Bible predicts is going to be happening in the last days. And you're going to see there's a lot more than this as we get through this study that we're going to be looking at. This is really just kind of an introduction to this Signs of the Times study that I'm going to give you and teach you over the next several weeks. It is unbelievable that we could look at what's happening in our world, look at the Bible, and not think that we are living in the last days. Again, we have to remember that even though it is sweet to us to think of God judging the earth for their rebellion and their sin against Him, it should make us sick to think about the suffering that people are going to endure because they have rejected Christ, because they have said no to God one too many times, and God finally gives them over to the evil that they have embraced because they have rejected the good and not wanted Christ to rule over them. So they're going to have the Antichrist to rule over them. We will pick up on Sunday where we left off here and continue our study of this interesting subject.